All right, we'll go ahead and get started. It's 4 p.m. Thank you all for coming. This session on looking at the philosophy of evidence-based medicine in 2024. Thank you in particular to the Evidence-Based Healthcare and Implementation Interest Group and the Research Directors Interest Group for co-sponsoring this didactic proposal. And thank you to the speakers here, Lars Beatty, Peter Weyer, Brian Kane, and Ken Milne for helping to tackle this topic, which stemmed from a discussion we had on one of the Evidence-Based Healthcare Implementation Interest Group monthly calls. And for those that aren't aware, there's been some challenges to evidence-based medicine as a concept over the years. People like John Ioannidis have said that maybe what the founders of EBM had said is not in existence anymore. And there's been examples that I've seen, particularly over the last year, that really made me start to think more deeply about that. One of them was, if you haven't seen it, ASAP and the Ophthalmologic Society had looked at corneal abrasions and started about 3 or 4 years ago looking at whether it's safe to give topical anesthetic for corneal abrasions, and have 5 ophthalmologists and 5 emergency physicians, and spent a couple years looking at the literature and debating. And as you know, many emergency physicians believe that this is safe, that there really isn't evidence of harm. And eventually the 5 ophthalmologists came to agreement with the 5 emergency physicians that this is probably safe, done correctly, used for a day or so in the right dosing, the right frequency, and no evidence of harm in humans. And the ophthalmologists took it back to their society and was promptly rejected. And ASAP published a nice article about it a couple months ago. I think it's still online. But it made me think that if you've got the evidence and you discuss the evidence with your other stakeholders and the evidence doesn't matter, what is evidence-based medicine about? And that's how this whole thing got rolling. And that's what we're going to discuss today. And the concept, you'll see we're not all on the same page. We all have different opinions about where we're at right now. But I think it's going to be an interesting discussion. And please do participate. We've got time at the end to ask questions and throw challenges at us, throw vegetables if you want to, but we've got some things that we want to discuss with you. Here's our conflicts of interest slide. And I'm going to start off by just kind of laying the groundwork of how we got where we are with evidence-based medicine in 2024 in our specialty and in the history of evidence-based medicine. And this will just take a moment. Way back in the 19th century, Osler had realized that when he's up at McGill, that not every doctor can subscribe to every journal. They don't have access to it. And that was the way to keep up with knowledge. You didn't have MRAP to listen to. You couldn't always go to the university and hear the didactic every week. And so they had a house party where people who subscribed to different journals, different specialists, would bring their pile of journals and they would discuss it on a weekly or a monthly basis. And that became known as a journal club, which many of us have been familiar with throughout our careers. In the 1960s, a gentleman who was an American ended up moving up to Canada named Dave Sackett, came up with this idea that you've got clinical care, clinical medicine, and epidemiology, but there wasn't such a thing as clinical epidemiology. And at McMaster University, they offered him the chairmanship of the first department of clinical epidemiology, and he came up with the concept of evidence-based medicine, which has been continued on in a textbook that Sharon Strauss is now the editor of. And one of his early mentees was a guy named Gordon Guyatt, who coined the term evidence-based medicine and developed the user's guide to the medical literature, which if you've never looked at it, gives you a way to critically appraise different study types, whether it's a diagnostic study or prognostic study, a cost-effectiveness study, a systematic review. There's particular questions that you can ask to probe the validity of that article. And many people have used that at journal clubs over the years, including myself. And others have followed suit, like Trish Greenhall in the UK wrote this well-read book on how to read a paper. And there's been many legendary voices in this field of evidence-based medicine, which really stemmed from some of Dave Sackett's fairly early thoughts. Emergency medicine, led by some of our early leaders, including Peter Weyer, who's here, went up to McMaster early on and learned some of those skills of what is that evidence-based medicine, the way that Gord Guyatt had envisioned it. And the user's guide to the medical literature, as I said, began to be a foundation for how we teach our residents and our trainees how to critically appraise articles, how to pull in the patient perspective and our clinical expertise, and then deliver the most contemporary care based upon the best evidence for the right patient at the right time. At my institution at Washington University, where I spent 20 years, I'm now at Mayo Clinic, But at WashU, we started a journal club based upon that user's guide format, where each of the residents, whether they could attend journal club or not, would have to turn in the critical appraisal form from the user's guide that they were assigned. They got 3 or 4 weeks ahead of time, so they had lots of time to look at the article, to do the critical appraisal, but they had to turn it in, whether they were in attendance or not. Then that got graded and turned back into them. And we use that as some of our core competencies for residency as proof of concept that they're learning how to do evidence-based medicine with these critical appraisal forms. So you could say that I bought this hook, line, and sinker. But the philosophies began to move a little bit, and that's what we're going to discuss. And Lars will talk next.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the evolution away from critical appraisal and sort of to provide some context and sort of a bit of the process surrounding this move. As we all have seen in our daily life and with residents and on shift, and probably use some of these resources ourselves, the free open access to emergency medicine education has become part of our lives. These are sort of the podcasts and blogs that exist out there, a subset of them, that have become used in sort of standard practice. I think this came to be for a number of reasons. I think a tool, the internet, came into being, right, about 25, 30 years ago. And the way we access information, the way we access the tools, the information we need to use to make decisions, changed, as opposed to repositories of information in experts, at universities, in libraries. Information became ubiquitous, accessible on a cell phone anytime, right? So you could be on a bus traveling to, I don't know, Las Vegas and look up, say, the historical Napoleonic Wars and read about that at any time at 3 a.m. in the morning, if that was the time you're on the bus. So the expectation of knowledge and the gathering of knowledge changed with the generations, the millennials and the Gen Zers. And these are generations that have grown up with the internet constantly accessible to them. They have not known a time before the accessibility of information. So what does that mean for our medical learners? Well, that expectation became, evolved and became, an expectation of our emergency medicine learners as well. And this is the result. And I think it's sort of, there's a push-pull. There's the tools that made it available, but I think there's sort of reasons behind it. The expectation of the Gen Zers who've grown up with the ability to access internet all the time when they became trainees in emergency medicine, they wanted to have the same accessibility to that information. Other things I think sort of pushed people towards away from the critical appraisal process. I think there's probably two camps of about two camps of opinions about the critical appraisal process and what its purpose is. I think there's a camp that really just wants, give me the evidence. They just want the evidence so they can apply it to patient care, as opposed to learning all the sort of nuances and detail about how to actually do a critical appraisal itself. So here we have these information sources that are available that have done that critical appraisal largely for us. So it sort of helped those people that just wanted the evidence to then begin to apply it in an accessible way. The other piece that sort of pulled people into this foam sphere was that critical appraisal takes time. It takes time. And if there's anything I think our medical trainees know and we know, is time is precious. So all these things sort of pushed us towards this. But if these are the places we're going to look to that are going to perform the critical appraisal, I think an important thing to remember is that there's heterogeneity in this appraisal, because who regulates this? Who says this is okay? So that's not to say that online resources are not useful or useful. It's just to say there's heterogeneity in that critical appraisal process. So Gordon Guyot, I think, as long ago as 24 years ago, started to notice that perhaps, teaching critical appraisal to everybody and having everybody competent in it wasn't the way to go. And he said that not all clinicians need to appraise evidence from scratch, but all need some skills. And this is part of his evolution to the point where a few years ago, in 2021, he put out an opinion stating that the understanding of research results, evidence summaries, and their applicability, not critical appraisal, are the core skills of a medical curriculum. A pretty 180-degree about-face of one of the founders of the evidence-based critical appraisal process. So this was a fundamental change in philosophy and a philosophical shift away from what he thought we should be teaching our practitioners of medicine. Why was this? I think, there's difficulties, there's hurdles to teaching the critical appraisal skills. There's evidence to show that, the penetration of the use of these critical appraisal skills is low. And to really be good at it, you need like constant immersions, intense experiences to really be good at the appraisal of medicine. So here we are in the sphere of having the free open access medical education online. And a group of people sort of thought, well, if we're not doing the critical appraisal process, maybe it's time we actually come up with a way of appraising the actual sources of evidence online, the blogs and podcasts. So this is where people have been looking more recently. One of the processes and tools that people have used to develop this assessment is the metric score. It's a pretty interesting study with 3 phases where they took, I think, about 231 different quality metrics for quality blogs, condensed them into a smaller subset using expert panels of bloggers and podcasters themselves, experts in the field, and users of the medical literature, that then gave this subset to a group of learners to then rate the blogs, a subset of blogs online. From that subset and from those ratings, they found the most concordant quality metrics and used that to develop something called the metric 8 and the metric 5 scores. So it's kind of meta in a way. It's we've gone from sort of the critical appraisal of the evidence and the literature itself to then critically appraising perhaps the bloggers and podcasters that are doing a critical appraisal online. And so this is sort of a tool, this is a sphere we're in now where we're sort of have these tools and we're thinking about tools to rate that online education. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Weyer.
Thank you. I want to start by clearing my throat, but also thanking Chris for having had the insight and the foresight to have organized this very timely session. And I'd also thank him for including me or including that historic slide that comes from the McMaster workshop in, I think, 1996, which included some of the folks who were involved in bringing EBM into EM, or EBM, if you will. I'd add a few people to the folks you didn't have a chance to recognize. Steve Hayden was on that slide. Carrie Chisholm, who made a huge contribution to EM. In the room here is Mike Brown, who's one of the folks who first brought our attention within the context of the interest group to knowledge translation. He currently edits the Cochrane Open Access Journal. Eddie Lang, who ran workshops in Montreal and recently as chair emeritus at University of Calgary, he recently was appointed to the Canadian equivalent of our National Academy of Sciences. Brian Rowe, who was the first emergency physician to really become heavily involved in Cochrane, who's a preeminent EM researcher at University of Calgary, University of Alberta, I'm sorry. So it goes on. Now, I promised Ken that I would insert a disclaimer to the effect that this icon in the upper right-hand side of this slide is a pure artifact of my limitations as a Photoshopper and has no connection to X-rated social media outlets or entrepreneurs. Now, as the, in a sense, the Pied Pipers of bringing EM and EBM together, speaking for myself, definitely, but I think speaking for most of us who have mentioned, we were pretty much apostles of EBM orthodoxy. And from an education standpoint, this page from the first edition of Sackett's evidence-based medicine book, which Chris mentioned, I think encapsulates what orthodoxy, as from an education standpoint, what EBM orthodoxy really amounts to. There are two components of it. The upper part here, this is a template for how to teach EBM to residents or medical students. And the first part requires that they kind of format their approach to defining information needs in terms of a scheme, patients, interventions, comparisons, outcomes, a PICO scheme, which is borrowed from systematic review methodology, and then funnel their thinking into that framework. And then the second part of it, which is, I've blown it up from the bottom, that is basically a template for how to report the findings of an educational prescription. And the wording here is quite significant, because after disclosing this search strategy and then the results of the search, the learner is instructed to move from validity of evidence to importance of valid evidence to the valid evidence as applied to this patient. So you can see right from that the emphasis is on the assessment of validity, i.e. critical appraisal. Now, after 2 decades of trying to make this scheme work with clinically oriented learners in 2 programs, I and some of my colleagues at Columbia determined that, firstly, the PICO framework was not really compatible with clinically oriented thinking and the way clinicians and clinical learners think about patients. And they all, results of resident surveys we did showed that they felt they'd had more than a lifetime's worth of critical appraisal methodology and statistics as part of the undergraduate medical school experience. So based upon that, we developed a different approach, which we call thoughtful reading of evidence into clinical settings, or TREX. And this is I would call this a literacy-driven, resident-driven initiative. And by literacy, I would invoke the kind of the implicit inspirator of our approach. Paulo Freire, who I don't know how many people here have ever heard of Paulo Freire. I'll raise my hand. He was a renowned Brazilian educator who developed, really reframed the whole definition of literacy, working with Brazilian peasants in the 1950s. He developed an approach to literacy which defined it as empowerment, and found that it was much more salient to embed his efforts in engaging the actual activities that his learners were involved in on a day-to-day basis, and to intersect the reality of their actual life and life experience. And that has had a lot to do with how we've gone about this. I have to commit myself. So what we did, and this goes back about 4 years. We're about 4 years into the program. We developed a team, which in addition to a couple of our chief residents to start with, included faculty, representation from quality improvement, administration, the pathway group, and program leadership. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail about how this works, but the idea is that instead of prescribing activities to residents or prescribing articles to be reviewed or this kind of thing, we follow what they're already doing. So we follow what the inquiries that residents spontaneously undertake, not as assignments, but as just as a result of their day-to-day experience in clinical work. We don't assign topics. We utilize the sources that our resident topic leaders themselves choose. Most of the time that means FOMED sources, like skeptics or Rebel EM or this kind of thing. And then primary sources that are led to through those kinds of entree sources. It's a small group learning, problem-based learning model. We use a loose template for evaluating the sources. And we've actually adapted the PICO framework to address really the applicability of research and information from research to practice, not as a way of formulating questions, but as a template for evaluating the applicability of research to practice. And that's the emphasis. Above all, this is not journal club. In Journal Club, the emphasis is on the articles, it's on the research. Here, the emphasis is on practice experience. And the objective is not to become an expert in evaluating research, but rather to begin to understand how one builds a community of practice, incorporating awareness and evaluation of the relevance of research findings, and not confined to the resident community, but broadening out to include dialogue with faculty, and ideally, this hasn't happened yet, ideally with the patient community. This is a poster. This is a kind of recruitment poster that one of our residents designed. And as a token of success, I think I can report that over the last year or two, we've begun to spur a lot expanded resident interest, including involvement of early years. PGY1s, PGY2s are now stepping forward with research they have done, literature reviews they have done in response to topics that interest them. The topics that interest them, things that obstruct their lives. Like we've had 2 sessions on contrast-induced nephropathy from IV administration. That drives them insane, having to wait for creatinines and stuff. So it's driven by the reality of their experience. That's about what I've got. I'm probably over, but that's it.
I was just busy trash talking Carpenter on Twitter, on X, just like. Thanks, yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, you go ahead and check it out, okay? So, yeah, my name's Ken Milne. I'm the creator of the Skeptics Guide. Oh, you're missing the best part. No, that's fine. I don't have anything interesting to say. No, really. Bye. See ya. Okay, so my name's Ken Milne. I'm the creator of The Skeptic's Guide to Emergency Medicine. Yeah. You want a piece of this? You should have seen what I was putting up about Chris. It was awful. And so I want to start by saying, this whole idea that evidence-based medicine is dead is a little premature, I think. The whole mic drop with Heisenberg from Breaking Bad, Gord Guyette saying 2 years ago, and for evidence, evidence-based medicine has only been around for about 30 years, right? And that's a short time frame in the world of the history of medicine. 30 years, that's it. Right? And so what have we done with evidence-based medicine and social media? We've combined it into this amazing little thing that we publish where? Oh, that's right, a peer-reviewed journal. Aren't you the senior editor? No, wait, you're the deputy editor. Wait, I think I see your name on this paper. This is hot off the press stuff, right? And so we take the blog, the podcast, and we put it together into this peer-reviewed article, and we get the best of both worlds for all you Hannah Montana fans out there. But hearing some of the other speakers, I was getting a very, very strong vibe. I'm trying to think of what it is. Something about get off my lawn. You know what? Blogs, podcasts, Instagram, formerly known as Twitter, TikTok, all that stuff. When journals first came out and there was this, flurry of publications and everybody was like saying, can you trust it? There'll be a consolidation, and there's been a consolidation around trustworthy sources. You are intelligent people. You can figure out what is worthy and what is not worthy. And these arguments against social media for medical education, or FOMED in my case, they're not new. In fact, they've been around for 2,500 years. This is 450 BCE. I think it was the first digital rectal. But this is Socrates. And Socrates, you know what he's complaining about? He's complaining about his students like Kayla over there. He's complaining that these students will look like they know everything, that they're so smart, right? And they're using social media to look omniscient, to have all the answers at their fingertips. And you know what Socrates was complaining about? You know what the social media was 2,500 years ago? Do you know, Kayla? Paper. Socrates' students were now writing down what he said, and he was like, if it was worth knowing, you'd know it. You wouldn't need your smartphone, right? And so he made all these complaints, and the only reason we know about these complaints is because his students wrote it down. And so, you mentioned the metrics study led by Brent Thoma out of Canada and a few others. And so we're figuring this out. We're trying to find the really quality sources when it comes to blogs and podcasts. But I don't think evidence-based medicine is dead. I don't think medical education is dead. I don't think we can't teach these critical appraisal skills. And I'm very excited about the future. I mean, who just downloaded ChatGPT 4.0? I did. It's amazing. What can we do with narrow AI? What can we do with large language models? You're talking about, the students don't have time. This gives them the time. We just have to give them the tools to be able to understand how to use it appropriately so patients get the best care based on the best evidence. The floor is yours.
Talk about feeling like the kid in the booster seat at Thanksgiving with the panel up here. So my name's Brian Kane. I'm supposed to bring this home. I'm a practical guy. I've been in APD for about 16 or 17 years now. So when I come to the concept of evidence-based medicine, I gotta be honest, I come to it as to what do I need to do to make my boss happy? How do I make the program director happy? So there's a couple of parts about this that this is labeled, the slide, Chris labeled this as old EBM, but for better or for worse, these are the milestones. These are the areas where, as educators, as faculty entrusted with the moral responsibility to take med students and formulate them into emergency physicians that we're supposed to inculcate into them and then objectively measure. And if you look at the slide here, there's a lot of this that looks like what Green published in 2000 in the Journal of General Internal Medicine, which to my mind has always been the best model of evidence-based medicine, which is very simple. Can the learner ask a question? Can they execute a search strategy? Can they appraise what they find and then apply it to the situation that drove them to ask the question in the first place? And that's typically thought of as being an individual patient, but we'll talk about there may be ways to think about that a little bit larger. So what have we done? It's, Peter, not really different from T-RACS. About 15 years ago, we started actually asking our residents at our program in Allentown to, while on shift, write down that process. Just whatever random patient they saw. Did you have a question? Okay, you did. How did you go about trying to answer it? What did you think of what you found when you went looking for information? And how did you use it? And because I missed that one faculty meeting, it's been my job ever since to read every one of these and give the residents individual feedback. So after we accumulated about a decade's experience of doing this, we actually, in a qualitative fashion, analyzed 10,000 of these. And we're starting to find, at least at our place, there may be some external validity issues, what this process looks like in real time. So what we're really ultimately trying to do is use Journal Club, like all the rest of our didactics in emergency medicine. If you're doing core content, the goal is, let's teach the resident about AFib, but what matters is on shift, do they know what to do? And bringing evidence-based medicine from Journal Club, from the free-for-all of let's all bring our journals to somebody's house, like was done in the 1880s, to actually the reason why we're doing it and make that overt link. Now, you heard me mention earlier that the reason that you ask the question is important. So when you look at the milestones, shared decision-making, interestingly, is not really embedded in either of the PBL milestones, either one or two. It's kind of sprinkled in a couple of areas. There's a little bit of it in communication, a little bit of it in professionalism, a little bit of it in systems-based practice, really meaning, as you saw Chris show in that original definition of EBM, it's that center point, but remember it was including the patient's values. So one of the things that when we look at these logs is, if I'm asking the resident to take the time to write all this down, there should be some sort of educational quid pro quo. And what we're really looking at is, when you did all this, was it confirmation bias? Or did you learn something? Or did you actually find something actionable? And I'll tell you, in our data set, it was rare, it was under 20%, but it happened. And in my mind, that's the sharp end of the educational spear, when you've given the learner that skill to go into the department on shift, do these 4 steps, and at the end of the day, maybe go to their attending and say, I think maybe we should zig instead of zag. What do you think? So where do we go next? I gotta be honest, Ken, I'm a little worried about ChatGPT and whatever layer you're at. I grew up with the Terminator movies. I'm pretty sure the ATMs are gonna rise up with one of these versions and take over.
I'm ready to bow down to my robot overlord.
Okay, so just if you could put it on skeptic guides when it's coming, so the rest of us will know when to bow down. Sure. That would be awesome. So, but this is new. This has only been out for 1 to 2 academic years, 1 to 2 cycles. And this is the second PBL milestone that I think we all have to start to think about, which is, how do we create a culture where the learner, because they want to, because they have a sense they need to, does this after they've left the confines of formal training? Not because they're forced to come to Journal Club, not because somebody like me has turned this into a procedure no different than an airway or a central line. That's where all those PBL logs are put into. They're just put into our educational software system. But how do we do this? How do we get the learner to really say, you know, I don't know that I know a lot about insert thing here. I mean, I know for me, when I talk with the residents and I let them know when I was in training, I rode my dinosaur, the hospital was uphill both ways, the dinosaur got cold because the snow was really deep. But there are whole classes of drugs that don't exist or didn't exist when I was in med school and residency that exist now. How do I model learning that to the residents? That's what this is about. So what have we tried to do to kind of marry the old and the new together? Because I think, like Ken, I'm not ready to throw all of this out. I think some of this may be signposting and some of this may be labeling, but evidence-based medicine isn't totally dead. Lars, like you said, it's a skill. Everybody's got to have it. The question is just, to what degree do they need to use it on a day-to-day basis? We all learned the Krebs cycle at some point in med school, and we all knew how many molecules of ATP it made, and I'm not going to ask any of you what the answer of that is, because we've all kind of forgot it. But we're consciously incompetent about that. We can go and look it up. Lifelong learning is something where you need to be consciously competent. You may have to think about it a little bit, but you've got to be able to do it, because in reality, we really want our learners to do it on every shift for the rest of their career. So what we've tried to do is come up with ways to offer Journal Club that's not a one-size-fits-all. So we have a curricula, one for the junior learners and one for the senior learners. And we have an objective metric. Are they learning some of these core skills? We happen to use the Fresno test of evidence-based medicine. Learning from Chris and other mentors. For the seniors, how do you take what you're learning and expand the green model of emergency medicine from that one patient to looking things up for the explicit reason of, I want to fix the system. I want to write a protocol or a guideline. So we will often, in early nascent stages of protocol development in our Journal Club, bring the evidence to the residents and let them hash out, what should our best practice look like? The Journal Club we did last week was on Hemocult. What are the test characteristics of that particular test that a lot of us still do in the ED? But when you look at the ROC curve, when you look at the sensitivity and specificity, it's not much better than flipping a coin. We're using the test not the way it was designed, not the way it was indicated. Should we keep using it? And it was a really interesting exercise where they had to run down references, that's an EBM skill. Analyze test characteristics, that's an EBM skill. Conduct their own lit search to make sure they didn't miss anything, that's an EBM skill. There were faculty that did point counterpoint. And at the end of the day, they started to reach consensus on, should we have GUIAC cards in the ED, yes or no? And that's that last bullet point, which is our learners are smart. They don't want to spend time reading an article that's just a random article. Link what you're doing in these areas up to something that you're going to do strategically anyway. Actually use Journal Club as a vector to implement the change you want. So the knowledge translation occurs with less leaks in the pipeline. I'm pretty sure I read a really great paper about that, and I think two of the authors may be right here at the table. So I'll end where I started, which is, thanks for letting me be at the big people's table here. I'm gonna go sit in my booster seat.
Well, I hope that we've painted a picture for you of where EBM came from and our different positions of how we arrived at where we're at. As far as the future goes, I think it's unwritten, and I think that a lot of you would like to hear from about what your vision of evidence-based medicine, given this changing paradigm and a new generation of learners, new technology, web that didn't exist decades ago. How do we shape this so that we have a learning product that empowers our learners to have lifelong learning skills? Brian had mentioned at the end about procedural competence, putting a chest tube in or intubating somebody or doing a lumbar puncture. There's no way that we would let somebody finish residency having never intubated somebody and say, well, you've never intubated somebody. You'll figure it out though when you need to. Here's a video you can watch. But for many residencies, critically praising the literature or finding believable critical appraisal, secondary critical appraisal sources, that's all they hand them. That they don't really have a journal club process or a way to show how to build those skills, even if you didn't during residency, what you need to do to build those skills. I do think that there's some promising tools out there for the secondary peer review sources, like the metric score. There are others. Earlier today, I was at a meeting for the American Board of Emergency Medicine where we're looking at the My EM Cert product and trying to put some secondary peer review sources in there for those that want to learn that way. They don't want to look at the original article, but they would listen to a podcast or look at a blog. And we're figuring out how to assess the quality of those different secondary peer review sources. So even at the highest level, it's going to touch all of us who are board certified in emergency medicine. We're trying to figure this out in a way that is sustainable. We do have some time for questions. I want to start with a question just to give some specificity to this. Ken, you had talked about using AI and ChatGPT to help start to empower us. And today at the ABEM meeting, we were looking at status epilepticus in pediatric patients. And there weren't any secondary peer review sources named in that particular summary document. And I found about 10 of them online when I looked real quickly. How would you use this technology how would you use the technology that you put forth to start to quickly at the bedside figure out what a believable secondary peer review source is?
I just want to represent Canada here, so I'm going to sparkle. How
Thank
would
you.
I use, sorry?
So all the resources you had put forth, the AI and the ChatGPT as a resource for us to use to find believable secondary peer review sources, how would you real-time use that in like 10 minutes in the emergency department?
And so what I'm doing right now is, this is where I'm spending most of my time thinking. And with ChatGPT or other large language models, you can put up 4 walls around it, and you can ask it only to search what you put up. And it gives you so much number of articles and documents that you can upload. And I think it's at 20 right now. And so what I did is I took my 12 years of 500 articles that I've critically appraised for my podcast and called it Skeptic AI. And I've been challenging it now. And so you can go to ChatGPT and ask the skeptic, what do you think about TXA for traumatic brain injuries? What do you think about using, I don't know, TPA for stroke? Something non-controversial. Seriously, these are the jokes, people. And then you can train it up, and it'll give you a natural language summary of papers that have been curated and selected, and originally by the Best Evidence in Emergency Medicine group. So they've been curated. We selected them based on a rating scale, and then we used a clinical appraisal tool developed at the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford to probe that literature for its validity. And over the last month, I've taken 200 more articles, and I'm training this ChatGPT to see if it will come out with the same critical appraisal that I would by running it through the system and doing machine language learning. That's where I think this is going. And you need to teach the residents and us how to ask the right questions and how to interpret the responses that you get. But that's what I'm working on.
Thank you. Open it up to the audience. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. Anybody want to raise anything?
This is not off the rack, okay? This is custom, if that's the question.
I don't need a microphone. Is your, I don't know a lot about AI, so is that something then you could transfer? Like, can I use Skeptic AI model?
It's not Ken, it's the Skeptic, but it will be free open access. There will be no paywalls, nothing.
Tony?
Thanks. Yeah, so first of all, I think we should recognize there's a lot of evidence-based medicine royalty in the panel. And Peter taught me evidence-based medicine way back when. I mean, thank you for that. But, so my comment / question, and Ken, I'm not sure what to do with the, as a fellow Canadian, I'm not sure how this works. You want a hug? All right, I'll give you a hug.
Canadians find each other in the audience.
Here you go.
They walk among you.
But I think Brian made a really key comment that, when we think about what evidence-based medicine is, and we go back through the definitions and the history of it, and the Venn diagram, which I always remember, critical appraisal is one of those three equally sized circles: the patient experience, rights, et cetera, and clinical experience. I think what we're really talking about, and what you mentioned, and I think is the focus of the conversation, is the transformation of the critical appraisal circle. And that is something, having been a very traditional, teach how to critically appraise and what is the likelihood ratio and the math behind it. No one wants to know that anymore. And I think that we've evolved, and we need to continue to evolve. The AI machine learning piece, though, is the, I think, new player that is going to accelerate things in a way that we're really not entirely sure. Can we trust it, and when can we? I think we can trust it. The question is when, how, and so I'm really interested to learn about how the panelists are using this or not using this, why or why not, and then Ken, maybe if you can comment a little bit about how you have created those parameters and validated those parameters, because just like validating FOMAD and the other synthesized pieces of evidence, how do we know that it truly is true? Because once we go to the AI solution, it's going to be the answer. And I don't think people are going to go back and really question the validity, the mechanics behind it. It's going to be taken as gospel, and that's how we're going to practice emergency medicine.
Thank you for bringing it back to the Venn diagram. I don't need it. Thank you for bringing it back to the Venn diagram. There's three circles in the Venn diagram. We've been talking about the critical appraisal piece, and there's the clinician's expertise, right? The clinician's judgment. And then there's also the patient's values and preferences, and they need to be respected, their autonomy and their agency to make decisions that we may not agree with. But when you focus in on the critical appraisal part, I like to think of it as, who here uses Microsoft Excel? Why aren't you using an abacus? Why aren't you doing it longhand? Why aren't you using a calculator? I remember when I was going through university, we weren't allowed to use calculators in some exams, right? And now you just pull up a spreadsheet and do a linear regression and focus in on the higher quality stuff. But to get to the idea of who's going to check the checkers or who's going to verify it, to be determined. It's, we came up with a process of peer review. How good is that? Is that the gold standard or is that a copper standard? So I don't know, but I'm really interested in figuring it out and exploring it.
Yeah,
Tony,
one of the things, Tony, that we had done at WashU was we added a question to the user's guide, the medical literature at the end that hadn't existed there before, of how you explain that to patients. How do you explain all this analysis, these stats that we just talked about, the potential flaws in the study? How do you explain that in plain language to a patient? And then Skeptic's Guide added that question on too. And I think that tries to get at least two pieces of that triad that you described, that Venn diagram, by making us translate what we just discussed and analyzed to the patient. It's a difficult exercise.
Some of your question, though, I think, is learning how to match your question to your search strategy. The analogy I use to residents and learners is golf clubs. Different clubs do different things. So background questions, at least right now with the technology we have, are far more efficiently searched in vetted secondary sources. Foreground questions, until we get enough articles into that database, are much better searched in a Medline accessible database like PubMed or EBSCOhost or Ovid. So I think until AI is Skynet, which I whispered to Ken I am very worried about, and it has everything, there's still going to be that which club in the bag are you going to use defined by the question you were asking.
I guess my question is more AI related. When dealing with AI and when feeding basically ChatGPT or any other AI tool with these articles or prompts, how do you deal with the kind of the shortcoming of it that it literally creates information when it lacks information? So at least the earlier versions, which is what is available for free to residents, which is kind of scary, to all of us, is that when it lacks information, it creates information. So you can ask it, like, find me, and I did this not too long ago when I asked ChatGPT, the Google version, the Bard, which is now another name. I asked it, find me articles about this thing. And it gave me a bunch of citations, and the whole citations, including the author, the publication date, the journal, it was all fake. It was all made up because it was lacking with what I was asking. I knew there are no papers on it. I just wanted to see how it responds, and it created a list. And I can, like, how do you deal with that when you are trying to train it?
So that's why I'm creating a specific site, as opposed to going out and doing your own Google research, which is, basically taking, I did my research on Dr. Google. Now you're doing your doctor research on Dr. GPT or ChatGPT, right? And so if you limit to curated, high-quality, vetted sites, right, then you don't have to worry about that, and you can train it. So I'm looking at including the excellent book on the diagnostic accuracy of testing, right, that you wrote, like, because that's the best information out there on that, so that you can probe it for that, and it'll also be trained to say, I don't know, because that's part of my philosophy of saying, if I don't have the answer to this, I'm not going to make it up. But with the existing ChatGPT and other large language models and narrow AI, they will hallucinate. And that's a big deal when it comes to medical information and learners. And so that's why we're trying to put these 4 walls around it and saying we're not going to let it hallucinate. We're going to teach it to say, I don't know if there's no information. And we're going to auto-populate it with the best of the best.
I think we have time for one more question. Mike.
Thanks, Mike Brown, Michigan State. Really thought-provoking, and I'm just curious. I'm excited about what Peter talked about in his program regarding how to really get residents excited about implementing research into their practice. But a question, just sort of a global question, is what skills do you think you expect the new intern to show up with? So in other words, what are the basic skills that you think a medical student should master before they show up at your door and start with your program?
Well, I would mention there that there is a very deeply ingrained framework within undergraduate medical education that people should be aware of, called the entrustable professional activities. This is the equivalent of the milestones, basically, for graduate medical education, but it's really a curricular requirement enforced by the AAMC upon medical schools. And I think it's EPA 7, there's a lot of them, it reads like the user's guides. I mean, it reads like a textbook of EBM. And so our residents, when we surveyed them, were quick to make us aware that the traditional EBM skills have been really drilled to them in most of their experiences. And unlike, somewhat different, at least at this time, in terms of testing, the board exams and the exams that the medical students have to take actually have questions on this stuff. So with that made me aware that really you can beat a horse, but basically, probably for most graduating medical students, they've gotten as much as they're going to meaningfully absorb at the point they graduate, and to continue to try to ram this down their throats, I think, is a fool's errand. I think it's time to become practitioners and to operate within a community of practice kind of framework and look at the social processes that determine actions, interpretations, and use of research.
I think we're out of time. I want to thank you all for coming today during this busy SAEM meeting. Thank you to our speakers. And please, if you have never checked out the Evidence-Based Healthcare Implementation Interest Group, do check us out. Our next meeting is at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, and we do have monthly meetings. And check out the Research Directors Interest Group meeting as well. Thank you.